All right, let's jump right in, shall we? Today, we're diving deep into MCDP-4. As a Marine, you know logistics is critical, but MCDP-4 really gets into how logistics shapes the battlefield, and that's what we're digging into today.
You got it. We'll unpack how your leadership directly impacts logistics, how the Marine Corps sets the stage for victory even before boots hit the ground, and how technology is changing things.
Sounds good to me. MCDP-4 uses this analogy, logistics is the engine, and command and control is the driver. What do you make of that?
Well, it's a really great way to picture it. Logistics, like an engine, determines your capability, how far and fast you can go, how much you can carry, that kind of thing.
Like your operational reach.
Exactly. But a powerful engine still needs a driver. You need command and control to make decisions on how to use that power, when, and where.
It all comes down to leadership, doesn't it?
It does. MCDP-4 is really all about empowering leaders at every level. The Marine Corps really pushes that, compared to some other militaries. Like, think about the Russians in Ukraine. Their logistics really struggle.
Yeah, they were making all the decisions at the top. Not a lot of flexibility or initiative from the junior leaders.
Exactly. No room to adapt to the situation on the ground.
Which is what makes the Marine Corps approach so important, right? That emphasis on making decisions at every level.
Right on. Every Marine is expected to own their part, be resourceful, and find solutions.
And that brings us to planning, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where things really get interesting. MCDP-4 really changed how I thought about planning.
It really goes beyond just beans and bullets, doesn't it?
Yeah, it talks about logistics, intelligence, preparation of the battle space. What's that all about?
So basically, you're looking at the entire battlefield through a logistics lens.
Analyzing everything.
Right, you're identifying threats to your supply lines, figuring out the best transportation routes and what resources are available, and what you might need to find locally.
Wow, that's a lot to consider.
And you have to be flexible. You have to adapt to the enemy, like what Southcom is doing against the drug cartels, for example. They use this logistics network analysis, but those cartels are always changing up their tactics, always finding new ways to move their products.
Constantly adapt. It's like a game of cat and mouse, isn't it?
It is, and that's a key point MCDP-4 prepares you for. These considerations start well before boots hit the ground.
It's about being ready, right? Setting the theater before the action begins.
Exactly. Setting up those networks, pre-positioning equipment, maybe even working with allies to ensure smooth logistical flows. You got to think about where your forces are, where the infrastructure is. It all plays a role in how quickly and effectively you can respond.
Like having all your pieces in place, right? So
Yeah.
when it's time to act, you can act fast.
Precisely. And now we're seeing how technology is helping with that, like Major Rodriguez and her team ensuring all those pre-positioned supplies are accounted for.
I read about that. It's incredible. Using all that tech to keep track of everything in real time.
Amazing, isn't it? Being able to predict what units need, streamlining the whole resupply process. In today's world where things change so rapidly, that level of agility is essential.
So it seems that keeping track of everything, maintaining that visibility is really crucial throughout the whole operation.
It can't be overstated. You need real-time information, not just for supplies, but for everything. Say a patrol engages the enemy, right? They've got to report their ammo expenditure, any casualties, equipment status. All that data goes back up the chain and informs decisions at every level. Do we press the attack? Do we change objectives? Do we need to send in supplies ASAP?
It all feeds into the big picture.
It does. It's about giving commanders a clear understanding of the situation so they can adapt on the fly. And technology is playing a big part, like this new classified ammunition location inventory system.
The classified ammunition, what now?
The Classified Ammunition Location Inventory System Integrated Dashboard, they call it CLEI for short. It's changing the game as far as logistics tracking and resource allocation goes.
Okay, that makes more sense. So are you saying technology solves all the problems then?
Not quite. Field Marshal Viscount Slim from World War II talked about this. Even with the best technology, logistics still comes down to people and making tough choices. He said he was constantly bombarded with requests, more troops here, we need ammo there, medevac this. But you only have so many resources, right?
And you have to prioritize those resources.
And that hasn't changed. Even with all the technology we have today, you have to make decisions about what's most important, what's going to have the biggest impact on the mission.
MCDP-4 emphasizes risk management a lot, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And a big part of that is recognizing that logistics plays a role in almost every decision. What if your supplies get hit? A key piece of equipment fails. MCDP4 encourages you to think about all that in advance.
To apply those core principles:
Mhm.
simplicity, flexibility, survivability, attainability.
Exactly. And, history is full of examples of what happens when you don't think about those things, like the decisions made during the Southwest Pacific Campaign in World War II.
Yeah, that was a fascinating part of the war. A lot of tough choices had to be made.
And logistics played a huge role.
I'm thinking about the decision to bypass Rabaul. That was a pretty big turning point in the Pacific, wasn't it?
It was, and it was a direct result of logistical considerations. They looked at what they had, what they needed to take Rabaul, and realized it would be incredibly costly.
So they took a different approach.
They did. They decided to bypass it, cut off its supply lines, and focus their resources elsewhere.
And it worked.
It did. It shows just how much those logistical considerations can impact the outcome of an entire campaign.
It really connects everything, doesn't it? Leadership, planning, technology, risk management. It all comes back to those core principles in MCDP4.
And we've only scratched the surface. There's so much more to explore in MCDP4, and that's what we'll be doing when we come back. Stay tuned. All right, so we were talking about how logistics shapes the battlefield even before the first shot is fired, and how it really plays into mitigating risk. MCDP4 has some really good examples of this, stuff that happened in real operations. Let's take a look at some of those.
Yeah, one thing that really stood out to me was this idea of force posture and how logistics impacts that. And I don't just mean where you put your troops, but the whole support network you have in place.
Right, thinking ahead, like setting up your pieces on a chessboard before the game even starts.
Exactly. You have to think about where you're going to base those forces, pre-position supplies, how to keep those supply lines open. It all impacts your effectiveness.
It does. It's all connected. And like we talked about earlier, it starts well before any actual fighting. You've got Marines working to set up those distribution networks, securing those ports, airfields, and transportation routes. It all has to be in place to move troops and supplies quickly and efficiently.
And sometimes it even means working with allies to get that logistical support.
Right. It's all about having a plan and making sure everyone's on the same page. Having a solid logistical network is what allows you to sustain operations, especially in a remote location or a challenging environment.
Makes sense. So what kind of examples does MCDP4 use to illustrate this?
Well, they talk a lot about forward positioning equipment and supplies and how that can really make a difference in a conflict.
I can see how that would be helpful, especially if you're dealing with a rapidly changing situation.
Yeah.
Having those resources already there, ammo, fuel, medical supplies.
Spare parts, everything.
Right, it means you can respond immediately. You're not waiting on a supply line to catch up when every second counts.
Exactly. And it's incredibly important for a force like the Marine Corps, expeditionary, able to deploy anywhere in the world, and often on short notice. You have to hit the ground running.
So you need to be self-sufficient, at least in the initial stages.
Exactly. But MCDP4 also acknowledges that forward positioning comes with risks. You're essentially putting a target on those supplies. What if the enemy takes them out? Or you get cut off somehow?
So it's about being prepared, but also thinking about those potential problems.
And having backup plans, right? What are your options if something goes wrong? How are you going to adapt? MCDP4 is all about flexibility and being able to adjust to those changing circumstances.
It sounds like maintaining visibility throughout the process is also really important. Knowing where your people are, where your supplies are, being able to anticipate any problems that might come up.
Absolutely. You need to know where your stuff is, how fast it's moving, and what might slow it down. And that's where this real-time information flow comes in. That's what allows commanders to make good decisions.
It's like that example we talked about earlier. Major Rodriguez and her team using all that technology to keep track of supplies in real time. That's what this is all about, isn't it?
Exactly. Using technology to your advantage, that's what she and her team were doing. They could track where everything was, predict what their units might need before they even asked for it. That's light years ahead of how things used to be.
Right, before it was all paperwork and radio reports. This is much more efficient.
And it allows you to make better decisions, too. You can allocate resources more effectively, avoid those shortages before they happen. You can even use logistics to gain an advantage on the enemy.
What do you mean?
Well, imagine being able to predict their movements based on where they're moving their supplies, or being able to disrupt those supply lines and cripple their operations. Logistics can be a powerful weapon when you use it right.
It sounds like logistics intelligence is the key. I remember MCDP4 talking about that, about using data to understand the enemy.
That's right. It's like being a detective. You're trying to put all the pieces together, figure out what the enemy is up to. By looking at their supply movements, you can start to anticipate their next move, where they might be going, what they might be planning.
So there's a lot more to it than just moving supplies around.
Exactly. There's analysis, strategy, intelligence gathering. It's about looking at the bigger picture, and that's something that MCDP4 really drives home. But it also reminds us that logistics is about more than just equipment and supplies. It's about managing people, too.
Right. You've got transportation, maintenance, medical support,
Hmm.
people who keep the machine running.
And it's important to remember that those people need clear communication, effective training. They need to feel like they're part of the team, that they can make a difference.
It's about empowering them to do their jobs.
Exactly. Because you can have the best plans, the best equipment, but it all comes down to the people who make it happen. And MCDP4 really drives that point home. Every Marine, regardless of what their job is, needs to understand how their actions impact the logistics of the entire operation.
It's that sense of everyone working together.
That's right. Every Marine has a responsibility. If you're a mechanic, you're keeping those vehicles running. A supply clerk keeps track of the inventory. A communicator makes sure the information gets to the right people. It all matters.
It all plays into the bigger picture.
Exactly. So, to sum up, we've looked at how logistics shapes the battlefield even before the fighting starts, how it influences where you position your forces, and how you plan your operations, how important it is to maintain visibility, to know what's happening with your supplies and your people.
And how all that contributes to managing risk. And how we can learn from history to make better decisions in the future.
And in the final part of our deep dive, we're going to get into some specific historical examples, some of the key moments where logistics really made a difference in the outcome of a battle or even a whole campaign.
Sounds like we're about to get to the good stuff.
Wow.
Okay, so we've talked about the theory, we've talked about the principles, but now let's see how all of this actually plays out in real life, in history. How did logistics impact the outcome of battles, even entire campaigns?
Well, throughout history, there are countless examples where logistics made all the difference. MCDP4 highlights some of those cases where, maybe the planning wasn't quite right or supply lines got disrupted.
Or just the sheer volume of stuff that you need to keep a modern military running. That can be a challenge in itself.
It can. And sometimes, even when an army has a tactical advantage, if the logistics aren't there to back it up, it can all fall apart.
Right. You can't fight a war if you can't keep your troops supplied.
Exactly. And MCDP4 uses a really good example from World War II, the Southwest Pacific Campaign. It's a great case study in how logistics impacted literally every decision.
Yeah, they talked about the challenge of capturing Rabaul, that Japanese stronghold.
Yeah.
It was really interesting to see how logistics played a role in the decision to bypass it altogether.
It was a big decision, and it all came down to logistics. The Allies, they were fighting a global war, right? Resources were stretched thin, and they knew that a direct assault on Rabaul would be incredibly costly.
Yeah, in terms of men and equipment.
And especially shipping. That was always a major bottleneck.
So they had to weigh the potential benefits of capturing Rabaul against those logistical challenges. It was a risk, for sure.
It was a calculated risk, and that's where those core logistics principles like flexibility and attainability really come into play. The Allies decided that instead of this massive frontal assault, they would take a more flexible approach.
And that's where the idea of bypassing Rabaul came in.
Right. They focused on building up their air power, cutting off Rabaul's supply lines, basically containing it instead of trying to capture it outright.
So they were able to neutralize a major threat without having to commit to a costly and bloody invasion.
And they were able to do that largely because they thought strategically about their logistics.
MCDP4 talks a lot about strategy, but it also brings up the human element of logistics, how even the actions of a single Marine can have a big impact.
That's right. And they have this incredible story about First Lieutenant Alexander Bonnyman Jr. during the Battle of Tarawa.
What an amazing story. This guy was an engineer officer, and he repeatedly risked his life to clear obstacles, lead assaults, secure objectives. He went above and beyond the call of duty.
And his actions are a perfect example of what MCDP4 calls that mission over self mentality. He knew how important his role was. He understood that his actions, no matter how small they might have seemed in the moment, were crucial to the success of the entire landing.
And he inspired those around him to do the same. His leadership made a difference.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that logistics isn't just about numbers, it's about people. It's about courage, dedication, that willingness to put the mission first.
And in the end, isn't that what MCDP4 is all about? how each and every Marine can embody that spirit, that commitment to excellence, no matter what their job is.
It is. It's about understanding that we all have a role to play. Whether you're a mechanic keeping vehicles running, a supply clerk managing inventory, or a communicator relaying vital information, it all contributes to the mission.
We may not all be on the front lines, but we're all part of the same team.
And that's what makes this deep dive into MCDP-4 so valuable. It helps us understand how logistics really is a warfighting function.
It's not just about beans and bullets. It's about thinking strategically, being adaptable, and always putting the mission first.
And on that note, we've reached the end of our deep dive. We hope this has given you a deeper understanding of MCDP-4 and the vital role that logistics plays in the success of every Marine Corps operation.
Thank you for joining us, and until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and semper fi.